This is what happens when you get desperate for them likes and subscribes. Hello and welcome to Rotted Review of the Day, and today I am taking a look at the 2019 movie, The 16th Episode. What I generally felt about this one, I kind of picked it on a lark. It just happened to come across my queue. I saw that it had a decent rating on IMDb, about 6.3 with about 3,000 some odd ratings there. So I figure, maybe this one will be pretty good. It's generally a higher rating on IMDb aggregate-wise than a lot of the movies I review. So I decided to give it a whirl. And what I found about this one was, I struggled a little bit about what I was going to say. And I think generally what I'm going to do is just talk about what I was feeling while I was watching it. But what I found about this movie is that it generally has a major identity crisis. It never really figured out what it wanted to be throughout the entirety of the film, both in perspective and in tone. And it made a major mistake, I believe, for a horror film pretty early on. And I'm going to get into that after I talk about the plot, but I'm going to go through the scores here. As always, 4 different categories, each one worth up to 25 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And this movie followed the characters of Helen, Einar, and Mark, who have a YouTube channel together. A fairly successful one at that. Now, they just finished filming their 15th episode, and they got 1.5 some odd million views, and but that's apparently down from their norm, and they want more. And generally what their YouTube channel is about is they go to a country and really immerse themselves into the culture. They're not just on a mini break holiday. They go there and they spend as much time as is necessary and, interact with the locals until they feel like they're dug in and they've explored the dirty, gritty side of things and release what they found on YouTube. And they are ready for their 16th episode, so they go to Casablanca. Once they get there, they get shacked up into a house at an Airbnb. The hostess is this, sweet lady that she just wants to hear voices in the house again kind of thing. So the price is dirt cheap, but the cost comes later. And while they're in Casablanca, they do the touristy stuff. They visit Rick's Cafe and so on and so forth. And they get invited to a wedding by a local pretty early on. And while there, it's clear it's not a typical wedding. It's, it has some ritualistic weirdness to it. And then for Helen in particular, things start taking a turn. She starts changing fundamentally, and Mark and Einar are forced to deal with that as she becomes unstable, and then as she becomes violent, figuring out what's going on with Helen, why, and how to survive in the meantime. And the movie goes off on its own tangent, but principally it is a possession-type movie. Now, when I talked about the identity crisis of this one, this really reminded me of an undergrad student that's just constantly switching majors. This is a found footage-type movie. It's done mostly from the perspective of Mark's camera. And there's a lot of self-referential stuff in there. They talk about horror films. They talk about found footage films and the rules therein. And I don't know, it was a little bizarre for me because while they were talking about all this stuff, they were doing it in a serious manner. So while Helen is possessed, and clearly possessed by this point, they're making crosses and basically using the tips from The Exorcist, and they're treating film as the mantra for their guide on how to deal with what was going on around them. And I've seen that work in movies before, but usually they have kind of a fun, lighthearted, bring the audience in for the ride kind of feel to it. You Might Be the Killer is one of my favorites as far as that goes. But this one, it just felt weird and out of place because there wasn't really, aside from a little bit of comedy coming from Mark, there really wasn't a whole lot of levity to be had here. It dealt with the subject matter in a serious fashion. And when you are trying to figure out how to deal with your best friend being violent, speaking a foreign language she's never heard or before, and so on, and generally going through this very, very serious time, in a place that you've never been to before. I don't know. It just felt like it was a cheap, cheesy thing for the characters to just start, the power of Christ compels you 15 times while she's laughing at you. It felt a little bit out of place as far as them integrating their knowledge of film into the practical, real-life application of solutions to the problem at hand. For some movies, it works. This one, I don't think it did. And the thing that I think really was the major sin of this one was revealing way too much way too early. I actually did kind of get endeared, especially to the Mark character, but that was way later in the film. This movie really needed to take its first 10-15 minutes and do a lot better of a job establishing its characters. Because by the time Helen was possessed and by the time Einar and Mark were trying to deal with it, I still didn't really know them. And I certainly didn't care about them. So there was a level of disconnect between me and the circumstances and the conflict that was surrounding the characters. And the possession happened so early on. It was going full tilt by half an hour into the movie. And that left another hour of kind of just going for the ride. And where you had a movie like The Exorcist where they were, trying to deal with it, doing tests, trying to reach out to the church, trying to get, so on and so forth. In this case, it was basically Helen just going on a rampage and Mark and Einar reacting to it. Not a whole lot of solution finding, not a whole lot of interesting stuff happening. It's basically just reacting to it, bickering among themselves at one, they'll hop from one foot to the other, again, tone, and the identity crisis of the movie. They'll hop from one foot to the other as characters between loving each other and hating each other. I guess they're brotherly in that way, but the abrasiveness of the characters to each other, of Einar and Mark, felt very raw and very visceral. Like there was some deep-seated stuff going on there. But ultimately, by having so much exposed so early without a whole lot of character development, what it did was basically make that last hour of the film, for me, a bit boring, which in my mind is one of the biggest sins that a movie can be. And then it started kind of going down the path towards the end there, without getting into any spoilers, of doing explanations and doing why things are happening. And then it kind of, it went down some weird plot paths that I just didn't care about a whole lot. And it did it in a little bit of a ridiculous way. I don't know. It just didn't resonate with me. I didn't really latch on to anybody or anything about this movie, except for one or two of the characters. And by the time I did, it was towards the end of, their run. Another thing about this was, as far as the identity crisis, was the perspective. This was, like I said, a found footage film, but it was constantly going from found footage from the viewpoint of Mark's camera out to third-party invisible floating head camera, basically your normal narrative perspective of, showing Mark with holding the camera, things like that, without actually having another camera there. So it was clear that, we were watching a film about making a film, but we were also doing it from the perspective of Mark's camera, making it a found footage film, while at the same time they're talking about found footage. It was just a mess. And it was really difficult to keep up with. And even in the most plot important times, to have a found footage perspective. And what I'm talking about, if you've seen the movie, again, not going to get into spoilers or at least specify them, but the very last shot was impossible from a found footage perspective. It was just, I couldn't really think of it as a narrative function of having a disembodied camera. It was simply a technical mistake. And there were a lot of those in this one that I just really felt like it needed more fleshed out. It needed more polish. It just needed a little bit more direction. And I think this could have been saved. As it was, I really didn't enjoy it, not nearly as much as the folks on IMDb have aggregated their score for. This one total of 45 out of 100 points. I really, this isn't one to avoid, but I also can't really recommend it. It's kind of hit or miss. If you see it in your queue and you really want to watch it, I'm not going to dissuade you from doing so. It's not worth actively avoiding. But at the same time, if you're looking for a good, scary, thrill ride possession movie, it's not going to be one that's going to escape my lips as one you should watch. So that should about do it. That's my review of the 16th episode. I really thank you for joining me here today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you like these videos, please click like and subscribe. And if you want to support me further, my Patreon link is below. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.